Hello, everybody. Really great to have the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon, not least because at CFGS we are pushing really very hard at the moment about the importance of engaging diverse perspectives in the process of making important decisions. And we think that the way that you are being engaged in the development of the Greater Manchester local energy market is in many ways good governance practice in action. So great to have an opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. As my wife will testify, I could literally talk about governance all day, but I've only got 20 minutes and there's a number of specific things that I've been asked to cover, and here they are. The first is to say a bit about what, from a governance perspective, we consider transparency to mean. Why transparency is important when you look at the way that organisations conduct themselves. Then we're going to move on and look at the word scrutiny, again specifically from a governance perspective, what it is and why it matters. Then we're going to talk about some of the potential advantages and potential downsides of organisations being open in the way that they conduct their business, before spending a few minutes exploring some of the differences that exist between public sector organisations and privately owned companies when we think about the way that the transparency and scrutiny governance aspects apply to them. So let's have a look at, first of all, transparency. Well, from a governance perspective at CFGS, we think it's best described as a process that puts arrangements in place that enable external stakeholders, people outside organisations, to make really well-informed judgments, first of all about the performance of organisations, and that's measured in a variety of ways, but of equal importance, it enables external stakeholders to make judgments about the way organisations go about doing their business. And as I say, that's become increasingly important over the last 10 years or so. Transparency within the context of governance has got three dimensions to it, we believe. The first is about what information you provide. There is no particular benefit in just providing a bomb burst of information. You need to spend time being thoughtful in gaining insight into what it's useful for you to provide to people in the form of information, and through that insight make judgments about what you provide. Secondly, the way that you present information, thinking about the kind of audiences that you want to communicate the information to, and then ensuring that it's presented in a fair, balanced and understandable way. And very often people who work within organisations develop a whole new language when they're describing what goes on that nobody outside the organisation could ever begin to understand. So thinking about the sort of language you use when you're trying to be transparent, open and explain what's going on in your organisation to external audiences is an important discipline, and one that perhaps organisations don't pay enough attention to sometimes. And then the third dimension is how much of it you provide. So you've decided on the nature of the information, how you're going to explain it so that external audiences understand it, but then there needs to be some discipline around only providing the information that is going to be of most use, so that you don't start burying important aspects of the information amongst other background noise that just makes the whole system incomprehensible. So there's three important dimensions to transparency. Why does it matter? Well, first of all, we've discovered over years that being open encourages trust in organisations. If people can see inside an organisation, understand what makes it tick, good and bad things about the organisation, they have more confidence and trust in it, which is a good thing whether you think about public sector or private sector organisations. It also within promotes an organisational culture of doing the right thing, and that kind of culture stops bad things from happening. And I'm not sure if any of you saw the recent documentary about the post office, the scandal with the Horizon IT-based accounting system. I think if you watch that documentary and look at the kind of cultures that existed both within the co-op and within Fujitsu, who were the technology provider of that time, the lack of openness led to really bad things happening, people's livelihoods being taken away and their liberty in some cases. So having transparency does drive the sort of organisational culture that just stops things going wrong in the first place. It's also got a very significant financial value, particularly when it comes to public sector organisations, because providing good quality information enables people to make well-informed choices about how they're going to spend their money and what they're going to do in their lives. And that's got very real economic value. Even back in 2013, which was some time ago now, a piece of research was done by Deloitte that demonstrated there's about £1.8 billion of economic benefit in transparency to the economy, and even more, £5 billion of value from a social point of view. So transparency really matters from a financial point of view. On the downside, the negative consequences of being caught not being transparent can be huge. If people find out that you've been doing things that you shouldn't have been doing and have been attempting to cover it up, and they expose that, particularly now in the days of social media when bad news messaging can spread globally in a matter of minutes, organisations, if they get caught doing bad things and not being transparent, can have their reputation shredded in a very short space of time. So there's a real downside to not being transparent. The other thing to say is that organisations, of course, want to attract the most talented, bright, diverse population of employees, and transparent organisations are generally seen to be good places to go and work. And therefore, if you are transparent, there's a very good chance you're going to attract good people who will come to your organisation and contribute to its success. And then finally, which links across to the next part of the presentation, is that by being open and transparent in the way that you operate, it facilitates effective scrutiny of your performance and the way that you're going about doing business. So the segue into scrutiny. What is scrutiny? Well, scrutiny is a mechanism from a governance point of view that enables you to introduce independent, constructive challenge into the process of decision making, which should do three things. First of all, it should hold decision makers to account. Secondly, it should improve the quality of decision making. And thirdly, improve the outcomes that flow from the decisions that the decision makers are taking. There's an important point about this word constructive, and that is that if you are going to introduce scrutiny as a means of providing constructive challenge, you need to sort of flip those three aspects of the purpose of scrutiny around. Your primary focus shouldn't be on holding individuals to account. Scrutiny is not a process that's intended to enable you to criticise people and browbeat them. The primary focus of scrutiny should be on improving the quality of outcomes that flow from decisions. As a secondary consideration, looking at the quality of decisions, and then the issue of holding decision makers to account sits at the bottom of that hierarchy. So if you're going to be constructive in the way that you undertake scrutiny, your focus should always be on the sort of holy grail of maximising the quality of the outcomes that flow from decisions that are taken within organisations. Another important point, I think, about scrutiny is that at its heart sits the principle of scrutineers, people who are involved in scrutiny activity, securing assurance about what's going on rather than settling for reassurance. And I think a really important distinction between the two things. In layperson's terms, reassurance is a sense of inner well-being that you get when a decision maker, probably somebody that you trust, tells you what's happening and you accept their version of events. Assurance, on the other hand, is really quite a different thing. And it's a scenario when a decision maker tells you what's happening from their perspective, shows you evidence to demonstrate what's happening. You, as the scrutineer, then explore and constructively challenge the evidence before deciding for yourself what's happening. So they are very different things from a governance point of view, and certainly if you're involved in scrutiny, you need to be securing assurance rather than settling for reassurance. And I'm afraid that experience tells me that history is littered of people in decision-making roles mistaking reassurance for assurance and really bad things happening as a result. And if if you ever get an opportunity, as I have, to look at some of the footage that's come out of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, particularly over the last 6 months, when councillors in particular have been asked questions about their governance responsibility for safety standards, etc., that were in place in the Grenfell Tower. Very often there's examples in that cross-questioning of councillors settling for what they were being told without constructively challenging it and getting to the bottom of what was actually happening in Grenfell Tower. And that is a very high profile and tragic example of the point I'm trying to make. But that's it in a nutshell. If you're involved in scrutiny, you need to be securing assurance rather than settling for reassurance. Scrutiny can happen at 3 points in the decision-making cycle. First of all, when you are deciding on the kind of outcomes that you want to achieve, what's the end point we want to get to? What is the point of the decisions that we are going to be taking? So scrutiny, introducing independent constructive challenge, can happen in the process of policy development. It can also happen at the point when a decision is about to be taken. So everything is shaped up, ready for a decision to be taken, but before the decision makers take it, independent people are provided with an opportunity to expose the details of that decision to scrutiny and to come to a well-informed decision about whether they think that the decision they're focusing on is likely to take things in the direction of the outcome that you're trying to achieve from the policy. And then thirdly, you can scrutinise after a decision's been taken. This is post-decision scrutiny, and this is very much about checking to see whether, having taken a decision on the basis of real-world experience, that decision actually, on the left-hand side, took you in exactly the right direction to where you wanted to go to without any twists and bumps in the road, or alternatively, sometimes the journey can have been anything but what you were expecting. And in that scenario, it's important that there's an honest appraisal undertaken of what happened, so that lessons that can be learned from decisions going wrong play into better quality decisions when they're taken in the future. Why does scrutiny matter? Well, as you probably picked up, it improves outcomes. Good quality scrutiny improves outcomes by improving the quality of decision making through holding decision makers to account. It introduces independent and diverse perspectives to the decision-making process. This was the point I made right at the outset about your involvement in shaping the way the GM local energy market is going to be. Introducing independent and diverse perspectives to decision-making improves the quality of decisions, in our view. It also introduces an end-user customer the decisions that are taken within organisations, and it helps critically to keep organisational thinking current. And if you look at case studies with organisations like Kodak, Blockbuster, Video, Nokia, BlackBerry, in their day, incredibly successful enterprises, but as a result of thinking going stale and then falling off the curb, I think primarily through not paying enough attention to customer insight, things went badly wrong for those organisations, and they don't really exist to any extent these days. So, advantages and disadvantages of being open. We're back to the transparency point. Well, I've already outlined the advantages in earlier slides of being transparent. Builds trust in organisations, promotes a really positive organisational culture. It's got real financial value. There's negative consequences that you can avoid if you're transparent that can do real damage to your organisation. The point about it attracting high calibre people to come and work for you, and finally the point about it creating the conditions for effective scrutiny. So we've touched on those already. As far as disadvantages are concerned, I'm not sure whether these are quite so much disadvantages or excuses, but I'll continue to describe them as disadvantages. There is no question that being open, particularly being open when things have gone wrong, can cause short-term reputational damage. And just to share an example, when I worked at Suffolk County Council, we were an organisation that had become responsible for public health and were promoting the benefits of smoking cessation. because it's a really important public health consideration. In parallel with that, we discovered that the investment that were investing our financial reserves were investing some of that money in tobacco companies. The reason that they would do that was because they were engaged to invest the council's money in ways that provided the best possible return. What we overlooked in the way that they were commissioned to do that work is that some of those investments, they may therefore turn out to be anything but ethical. And it created a real issue for the county council in the short term, because on the one hand, they were promoting the benefits of smoking cessation. On the other hand, they had an investment company investing their money in tobacco companies. And it caused a huge amount of bad publicity when the news broke. What I would say is that it was relatively short-lived. And the other thing that I would say is, I think what I've just explained to you is an example of why upstream scrutiny can be really valuable. I mentioned that scrutiny can happen either when you're about to take a decision, after you've taken a decision to reflect on how effective it's been, or you can engage in scrutiny activity during the process of shaping the sorts of decisions that you're going to take. And for me, that's an example of an organisation not paying enough attention to scrutinising and challenging the policy development process. So there's a potential disadvantage. It can create a risk that contractual obligations will be breached. If you're open about your commercial interactions with contractors that you use, if issues are surfaced in public around employment contracts that you have with specific members of staff, you can quite literally end up breaking the law and be prosecuted as a result of it. But that for me is not about not being open, it's about accepting that unconditional openness is not something in an organisational context that you will ever achieve. But being open by default is the sort of mindset that you want to have. And then the other thing to say is that if you're going to be open in a way that is useful to external stakeholders, particularly in terms of getting real insight about the sort of information that needs to be provided, how it should be provided so that it's tailored to different external audiences and providing the right amount of information, all of that needs to be resourced. It doesn't happen by magic. So transparency is something that you need to take a conscious decision to focus on, and then make sure that you properly resource it in an organisational context. A little bit now about transparency and scrutiny in the public versus the private sector, and we'll start with transparency. In the public sector, primarily because it's funded by using your money, our money, public money, there is very significant legislative pressure, legal requirements on public sector organisations to be open and transparent. And there's a range of legislation and codes of practice, including the Local Government Transparency Code, that is intended to ensure that levels of transparency are as they should be. It's a pretty onerous regime. If you work in a public sector organisation, you have to publish details of all transactions over £500. So there's a lot of information available about what public sector organisations are spending their money on. Members of the governing body, the people who make decisions about the extent to which you're going to be transparent or not, are elected representatives and are therefore accountable to you, the public. Quite in the private sector, rather than being a legislative pressure, my view is that private sector organisations should focus on the commercial advantages that there are in being transparent. The driving force behind transparency and accountability for decision making and so on is driven by your shareholders and stakeholder expectation, rather than legislation in the way that it is in the public sector. And finally, from a scrutiny perspective, let's have a look at some of the difference. Well, again, members of the governing body are elected representatives. They are accountable to you, to us as the public, for the quality of the decisions taken, and therefore it's them that are exposed to scrutiny. Members of the governing body, council very often, are elected lay people. So they're people who've very often got successful professional backgrounds, but they are elected and often find themselves in decision-making roles. roles, in which they have no professional background. They're lay people. Value for money in the public sector, when you're looking at scrutinising the quality of decisions to see whether they're achieving good value, is focused on the ratio between investment, the amount that gets spent, and a return from a citizen outcome point of view. So we're spending this much public money, how much positive difference is that making to the lives of citizens? Conversely, in the private sector, members of the governing body, the board, are accountable to their shareholders rather than members of the public. Members of those governing bodies, those boards, are not elected, they're appointed, and they're appointed on the basis of their professional expertise. So quite a different scenario in contrast with the public sector. And the value for money test in the private sector is primarily focused on the ratio between investment and profit, which translates into shareholder return. What I would say is that increasingly that is starting to change, in part because organisations are being more transparent, and there is more of a focus now on the way that organisations are going about their business, not quite such a relentless focus on profit, and that's being driven under the sort of umbrella term of corporate social responsibility. So, quick summary of the main points. First one is that, in our view, transparency and independent scrutiny are non-negotiably important components of good governance in organisations. Organisations, as I mentioned, we think should have a transparent by default mindset, being cautious about some issues that you need to be careful on with transparency, but in general terms, be transparent by default. And then finally, effective scrutiny requires constructive challenge from a diverse range of perspectives, including those of customers and service users. So that's a whistle-stop tour through some of the headlines that I hope at least are useful to you as jurors on the two aspects of governance, transparency and scrutiny.
Okay, so the first question is the strength of the Freedom of Information Act on companies. Wholly owned by local authority, partly owned by local authority, and completely private, but operating on behalf of a local authority. Have you got an answer to that of what the strength of the Freedom of Information Act is?
So you were breaking up slightly there. The Freedom of Information Act I picked up. So just remind me what the focus of the question is. Would you mind, Rachel, please?
Yeah, okay, sorry, Andy. So the strength of the Freedom of Information Act on companies, on different companies, so companies that are wholly owned by local authority, privately owned by local authority, or completely private, but operating on behalf of a local authority.
So I think that certainly the amount of resources invested in complying with the requirements of the FOI is strongest with public sector organisations wholly operated by public sector oversight bodies.
Okay, thank you.
Would be my view, but that is no more than my opinion. It's not a matter of fact, but that's my sense, okay. Is that there is more attention focused on it from a public sector perspective.
Great, thanks, Andy. And then, how is scrutiny measured?
Scrutiny is measured on the basis of evidence to demonstrate that it's positively influencing the quality of decisions that are made and outcomes that are achieved as a result. So because it's an independent process, the way that scrutiny works is that the independent group of people introduce constructive challenge and make recommendations about what should be done in relation to decision making as a result of their analysis. The impact of scrutiny is all about what happens with those recommendations and what influence does it have on decisions that are taken and performance and outcomes that arise. So the focus should always be on the impact that's being achieved through scrutiny rather than the amount of work that's being done, for example.
Great, thank you. Sorry. And then a follow-on question really is the risk of placebo effect is there now too much info to scrutinise?
Well, that is an excellent question, and our view generally would be that with good quality scrutiny, less is more. So start by thinking about the kind of outcomes that the decisions are attempting to achieve, and concentrate on what will facilitate the delivery of those outcomes. When you are working on a scrutiny body, there's also something really important about the nature of the support that you get, the way that information is provided to you that gives you the insight you need, first of all, to decide what you're going to scrutinise, and then how you're going to scrutinise it.
Brilliant, thank you. And the same question for transparency. How is transparency measured? How do you ascertain that something is balanced / understood?
Well, I guess by asking the people who you are being transparent in the interests of, the engagement that you have with external stakeholders, such that it enables you to assess whether they are genuinely understanding the performance of your organisation and the way that it goes about doing its business. The quality of that engagement, the way that you engage with external stakeholders, is crucially important from a transparency point of view. Otherwise, you can fall into the trap of feeling that you're being transparent, but not actually putting external stakeholders in a well-informed position.
Thank you, Andy. And a juror said, from experience, CSR often attracts right candidates, but these values don't carry over into hiring policies. So right candidates aren't always hired. HR aren't always aware of CSR initiatives. What's the best way to address this?
This is about the way that organisations go about recruiting people in line with their corporate social responsibility. But I would say this, wouldn't I? The issue about embedding EDI, good practice, equality, diversity and inclusion, good practice into organisations, I think is through paying attention to all the principles of good governance. So starting with the values that your organisation espouses about the importance of having a diverse, talented workforce, then thinking about the sorts of things you want to achieve as an organisation, the way that you build your workforce so that it's aligned to delivering the things that you want to achieve, the way that you go about monitoring progress to check that there's no gaps between the rhetoric on CSR and what's actually being achieved, and then reporting in a really open, robust and honest way about what you're actually doing. So there are a number of principles of good governance, and if you focus on CSR and try and assess the extent to which you're actually walking the talk, then thinking about it in relation to each of those governance principles is not a bad way to approach the question.
Thanks, Andy. And this is the last question. By doing this, will we be saving any money or anything in a similar way through being transparent?
Yes. As I mentioned during the course of my presentation, there is real financial value to both transparency and scrutiny. By being transparent, organisations enable people to make well-informed decisions about how they spend their money and what they do with their lives. Good quality scrutiny also shines a light on those sorts of issues, so there is definitely financial value in the work that's being done here.